My name is Mahika Phutane. I'm a PhD candidate in computer science at Cornell University, and today I'm excited to present my work, Cold, Calculated, and Condescending, How AI Identifies and Explains Ableism Compared to People with Disabilities. So I won't say more, and I'll just dive right in. So people with disabilities experience various forms of harm online at nearly 3 or 4 times the rate than people without disabilities, and this harm is just increasingly growing according to these articles. Disabled content creators like disabled authors or even Paralympic athletes are talking about facing online abuse, bullying, and online ableism. And before I talk more about ableism and AI, I also just wanted to brief you on what do I mean when I say ableism, right? What does ableist speech look like? And it can look like a lot of things. It can be associating disability with suffering or sadness. It can be framing it as something inspirational or using derogatory language, like, if this crippled can do it, what's your excuse? It can be asking invasive questions like, can you feel down there? It can be, reframing it as something toxically positive, like, it's not a disability, it's a different ability. Or it can be associating disability with having a bad attitude or being lazy. And these are all various forms of ableism, and we group this under this umbrella of ableism. So like I mentioned, online platforms are cluttered with this kind of ableist speech. And currently, these platforms use AI systems to combat some of this hate, right? So everyone in this room probably knows we have toxicity classifiers like Perspective and Azure, and now more and more we have LLMs like GPT-4 and Claude being used for moderation. So the question then opens up is that, can these AI systems identify ableist speech? And this actually hasn't been explored yet. And to answer this question, we need to do a couple of things. We need to first create a data set of ableist speech. Then we need to collect AI and human assessments of this data set. And third, and I think more uniquely, is that also gather human evaluations. I wanted to ask people with disabilities, how do you think AI did? And kind of loop that cycle backwards. So this is overall what I did in this paper, and I'll dig more into each step. So I created a data set using first-hand accounts of ableism from social media, blogs, and previous academic papers, right? And the data set looks something like this, where we had a comment like, the second one, life is not worth living if you can't walk. Very ableist, the disability that it associated with, which is an orthopedic or physical disability. And here the hate was pretty explicit, and we do have more implicit forms of hate as well. Once I had this data set, I asked LLMs and toxicity classifiers to score ableism and toxicity for these comments. LLMs, I also asked them to explain why they think it's ableist. And similarly, people with and without disabilities also provided ratings and explanations of toxicity and ableism. So once we had all of this data, then it became about doing a mixed methods analysis, crunching some of these numbers, but also doing qualitative coding to analyze differences and comparisons amongst this data. And like I mentioned, looping it backward, actually, having people with disabilities evaluate some of these comparisons as well. So what did we find? What did we find? Well, firstly, we did find that there was a strong misalignment between disabled people and AI models, and starting right off the bat, toxicity classifiers struggled to identify ableist speech. In this graph here, we see the purple are the toxicity classifiers, the teal green are the LLMs, and the pink box plot is people with disabilities, and we see toxicity classifier scores being extremely low. But even for more explicit speech, like you are the R word, which is a well-known slur, kind of pass through the perspective filters at a 1.34, and these numbers are between 0 and 10, while people with disabilities rated both these statements really high. And we see that LLMs did pretty okay here, but for more implicit forms of speech, like depression is not a disability, we start to see some variance in these ratings. And for something like, wow, your fashion sense is amazing, even though you can't see, which is pretty microaggressive, we see LLMs, completely not really recognize that this is ableist. So we start to see these, differences in ratings. And interestingly, for some comments, LLMs significantly overrated ableism and almost made up ableist sentiments. For instance, this comment saying the M word is a slur and it impacts people with dwarfism even today, we see GPT-4, Claude, Llama all rated pretty moderately ableist, while disabled people recognize that this is not really an ableist statement. And we start to look at explanations to see why they rated it such. And GPT-4 said that this comment embodies a high degree of ableism because it has a stigmatizing slur. And true, but also this explanation is not accurate. This is merely a fact. And we see that it doesn't even recognize the difference between ableist speech and just facts. So explanations actually really pointed at the inadequacy that these LLMs had in recognizing ableism. For instance, descriptions of ableism were really vague. They would just say that, oh, this statement perpetuates stigma, without really saying how. A disabled person, in response to a GPT-4 explanation, said, I would like some more explanation. Why is it harmful? Why does it contribute to stigma? Or how? And they found these explanations to be really unsatisfactory. Equally, these explanations are really cold and clinical, and they almost reflected this very outward gaze that we often have towards the disabled community. For instance, the comment, it's survival of the fittest, was described to be toxic and ableist because it misuses Darwinian concepts to justify exclusion, as said by Gemini, which is true, but we see people with disabilities kind of get right at the harm, right? They say it's invalidating, it's dehumanizing. It implies that people who aren't the fittest should die or deserve less, and that really gets at the crux of why this statement is harmful, which we do not see LLMs capture. And lastly, their explanations were also judgmental instead of being educational. For instance, something like, I pray that God takes over your wheelchair forever. GPT-4 called this malicious, and Claude called it demeaning and reductive. And maybe, but we see disabled people give a more balanced perspective, saying that this is ableist, but it's also well-intentioned. And they, I quote a participant here, the language being used by AI is very over-the-top and judgmental. Using anecdotes and humanizing language could lead to more empathy and provide able-bodied people and how they might be able to be helpful. So we start to see here that these explanations are really important to accurately raise awareness for ableism and disability in general. So what, right? And I want to answer two questions as I leave today. Is one, what are the downstream effects of misclassifying ableism, right? So what? But also, why is identifying ableist speech so challenging? What makes this problem so hard? And the downstream effects are pretty easy. Well, we have false negatives, and then that just allows a lot of ableist content to stay online because these AI systems don't recognize this ableist content. But equally damaging, we have false positives, which can falsely suppress disability awareness or disability advocacy data. And disability erasure is already a really, really large and ongoing problem historically. And we saw for explanations, these explanations were more than just a moderation tool, right? We see a lot of explainable AI work like explain hate and these kinds of things coming about. But it's not just about explaining the hate to moderators, it's also a form of advocacy that people with disabilities really wanted to do here through their explanations. And poor explanations could undermine these efforts to raise awareness. So why is identifying ableist speech so challenging, right? What makes it hard? And one, because it's just a byproduct of our environments. For instance, in conferences, we say blind review process pretty easily. And I know disability scholars that have told me that they found that term pretty offensive. And ableist. But it's just what we do, what we say. So it's a byproduct of our environments, and it's really hard to catch. Two, it's hard to represent disability when disability is often on a spectrum. It's progressive, it's dynamic, right? We have the vision spectrum, we have the autism spectrum. So when we start thinking about benchmarking for ableist speech, how do we create a benchmark that kind of meaningfully represents these very fluid and diverse identities? And three, just ableism is often an evolving language, right? For instance, we used to say person with visual impairment, then we started saying blind people, and then we started saying person with visual impairment, and then blind people again reclaimed their identity, being like, no, we want to shift from people first to identity first language. So kind of how do we represent these, evolving shifts in ableist speech? And lastly, I'll just leave with inclusion. And in current toxicity classification systems, like the identity attack parameter on perspective considers race, gender, sexuality, but not disabilities. So people with disabilities are being excluded from discourse and development of automated content moderation, and really including that as a parameter is the first step. So that's been me. I'm sorry a little bit over time, but I'm Mahika and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Vika.